Hey folks, it's Mike from Cymulate here in New York, and I know I've got everybody muted at the moment. We are recording this demonstration for use in some of our training materials, so I'll be taking questions through the chat functionality, but everybody will stay on mute. So today we're going to go over what Cymulate is and give you a brief overview of the solution set and walk through a demonstration of it. And we'll do that all right here through this system that I've got in front of you now. So Cymulate is a breach and attack simulation platform. What does that mean? Well, it does what it says on the tin for the most part. We simulate the same methods and techniques that are used by threat actors to gain access to resources, to disrupt operations, to perform operations that they should not be able to perform. And we allow you to evaluate the results of those simulations by comparing them against industry standard security frameworks and providing remediation guidance so that you can identify how to strengthen whatever weaknesses or close whatever gaps are discovered. And all of this is done within one platform, so you don't have to use several different tools to do several different things over time. Now, Cymulate allows for the most comprehensive simulations available on the market that we've seen. We focus not only on pre-exploitation or post-exploitation attacks, I should say, things like lateral movement, which we absolutely cover, but also pre-exploitation attacks, things like malicious spam emails and direct attacks against web gateways and web app firewalls. And we allow you to perform single vector simulations where we're focusing dozens or hundreds or thousands of different methods and techniques against one set of security controls, and multi-vector simulations, where we are instead picking and choosing individual methods and techniques from multiple vectors to string together into an entire attack chain. And as we walk through today's discussion, you're going to see how we actually do that. But let's start with single vector simulations. So we break them down into three component categories. Pre-exploitation is threat actors going after systems rather than devices or people. And the common ways that this is done are through email gateways, first-party systems like Office ATP or G Suite Security, third-party systems like Proofpoint and Mimecast and Ironscales and several others. We can test the effectiveness of all of these different types of email gateway security solution sets. If none are in place, we can also clearly show the need for one of these solution sets. But we're vendor neutral. So whatever is in place or will be put into place, because this can also be used to objectively test different solutions in a bake-off scenario, will be assessed by the email gateway vector simulations. Web gateway, which of course includes things like firewalls, but also proxy services, VPNs, DNS filtering, content filtering. Essentially, if it manages the north-south traffic flow, then Web Gateway is going to assess the effectiveness of those security tools. And Web Application Firewall, which are solutions that sit in front of websites and web services and web apps, as their name would imply, that defend those platforms from external attack. And from there, we can look at exploitation attack vectors. And these are attacks that are focusing on devices like desktops, laptops, virtual machines, servers, cloud instances, etc. And attacks against users through things like phishing. And so Cymulate allows you to simulate phishing attacks of various and assorted different levels of complexity, from simply a bad link in an email to actual simulated login pages where we could try to phish credentials. We do it safely, of course. All of the vectors are non-destructive and non-disruptive. And so we won't actually exfiltrate the credentials, but we will know if a user has supplied credentials and therefore failed the phishing awareness test. And endpoint security, where we have simulations that are suitable to test both traditional anti-malware, signature and heuristic scanners and things of that nature, and next generation anti-malware, EDR platforms and behavioral-based detection systems. And we could do that whether there is one form of that type of protection or multiple forms in place. And we'll also look at non-third-party methodologies like effectiveness of group policies or settings and configuration. And then we look at post-exploitation. And this is the most common in the breach and attack space, But with Cymulate, this is one part of a larger whole. And in our case, we definitely look at things like where an attacker who has established a foothold is able to go within an environment with our lateral movement vector, and what they would be able to remove from an environment with data exfiltration. So if we're talking about an environment that has a data loss prevention system, is it prohibiting the uploading of protected files to HTTPS websites, or sending them via SFTP, or copying them to a USB device, removable storage? Now, we bring all of these together in two ways. One is, of course, being able to test in each one of these single vectors. But we can also test across multiple vectors. And here's the reason why. The single vector tests are critical. They are going to expose weaknesses and gaps, if they exist, in these individual sets of security controls. But in the real world, you also need to be concerned with how these controls work when they need to cooperate. Specifically here, we're talking about defense in depth, or the theory of compensating controls. If something is able to exploit a weakness in the endpoint security, then you want to make sure that the email gateway and web gateway properly deflect it. And so we can allow you to create customizable full kill chain simulations, where you could pick individual methods and techniques from multiple vectors and choose the infiltration method, the payload that will be delivered, how it executes, what it's simulating, is it a worm, is it ransomware, is it custom code, etc. And see how all of these different security control sets interoperate with each other. There's a second form of this theory, and that is immediate threats intelligence. And we actually have a video on that, but at its heart, immediate threats intelligence is the Cymulate threat research team putting together multi-vector simulations based on currently propagating threats. And so as we go into the demonstration, you will see how we can handle both these single vectors and these multi-vector scenarios. So let's jump into the Cymulate console. This is Cymulate. It is a SaaS-based platform. There are two components that routinely get installed into the environment that will be tested. The first one is simply an email account, an email box. It typically has a forwarding rule, but there are other options available if forwarding rules are not permitted. And it is the same as any other user mailbox that is defended by the email gateway security controls that are going to be assessed. The other component is an agent. And we have agents for, I'll bring up this list here, Windows 32 and 64-bit, desktop and server. So Windows 7 or higher, Server 2012 or higher. Mac OS from Mac OS 10.13 and up through Catalina. And Linux. And right now we support Red Hat and Ubuntu and all of their forked distributions at the 64-bit instruction set. And so you'll deploy at least one agent. Now, unlike some other platforms that you may have seen, you should not be installing agents on every device. As a matter of fact, we want to keep the number of agents to a minimum. You basically want one agent per unique set of security controls. So if everyone in the environment is going through the same firewall, and they're using the same anti-malware tools, and they're subject to the same domain configuration, you only need one agent. And we'd be able to effectively test those security controls through that one agent. In larger or more complex networks and environments, you may need more than one agent. In instances where there are a lot of different operating systems, you may need more than one agent. But adding more agents than are necessary does not gain you any better results. And it does increase the overall administrative workload, and so we want to keep this to a minimum. So you'll have at least one agent deployed, and you'll have this email address set up and forwarding anything that comes from the Cymulate assessment system back to the Cymulate platform. And then the rest of the solution set becomes available for use. So let me walk you through the dashboard. On the left-hand side, we have all the vectors that we talked about in the PowerPoint, and we're going to look at a couple of these as we go through the demonstration. We have an activity center, and that activity center shows currently running simulations and any that have completed. And that information is also, for the most part, mirrored over here in the attacks trace panel on the right for ease of use. And we have a reporting section that shows the reports of any completed assessments. We're going to look at a couple of those reports as we go through the demo. In the center, we have the current cumulative scores for each of the vectors that have been simulated. And these scores, the Cymulate scores, are the numbers out of 100 that you see in the middle of each one of these circles for each vector. The Cymulate score is a weighted average of the results of the assessment compared against 4 leading security frameworks: NIST 830, CVSS 3, Microsoft's DREAD framework, and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And the issue has always been that even though these 4 are considered gold standards, they place very different weight on different components of their frameworks and simulation output. So Cymulate compares the results of the simulation to all 4, performs the necessary mathematical calculations, and produces a unified score, the Cymulate score, on a scale of 0 to 100, with higher scores indicating higher risk. So unlike in our demonstration environment where many things were purposely mistuned, you are going to want to see these scores be below 30 whenever possible. A score of 0 is theoretically possible, just to be clear, but typically, unless it's a single-use terminal, like in an operating theater or for a bank teller, where only very specific applications are permitted to be run at all, it would be very difficult to approach 0. But anything from 10 to 30 would indicate a good, solid security protection set around that environment. So let's take a look at a couple of these vectors so that you could see how simulations are performed. Let's start with endpoint security. This is a very popular topic, especially with people working remote and they're no longer directly behind the firewall and things of that nature. The endpoint has become a major attack surface. So when we do an endpoint security assessment, as with most of our assessments, you're going to define 3 factors that make up what will be done. The first is what is going to be simulated. That is typically defined by templates, which are these tiles that you can see right here. Cymulate provides multiple assessment templates out of the box. You may also, whenever you need to, create custom templates that allow you to pick and choose what will be simulated. You'll define where we're going to test by identifying an agent or an email address, or in some cases both. And you'll define when the assessment will be performed. Assessments can be performed as one-off events, either immediately or at a time in the future that you specify. Or you can set the system up to automatically run the assessment on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And so this is a technology set that is really designed to be automated and to perform these tests on a regular basis so that as the cybersecurity world changes, new methods and techniques come into play, new versions of operating systems start to get used, new software comes into the environment, you're automatically running the latest simulations against the latest platforms and operating systems and applications. And you can keep a very close eye on the overall level of security within the organization by doing so. Now let's talk about what types of things are simulated. So with endpoint simulation, we generally recommend, if there is no other starting point to find, that you start with the best practice. And our best practice, you could see in the upper right over here, we'll use 2 forms of testing files to determine the effectiveness of the anti-malware solutions and the settings and configuration of a device. The first set, and there are close to 1,700 of these, are what we refer to as AV files. AV files are never executed. As a matter of fact, many of them are not even executable. They all, however, have known malicious signatures. And so these files are transmitted in batches. We're not going to send them all at once so we don't disrupt any other things you have going on. They're sent in batches to the agent, which then writes them to disk and checks in on them for 120 seconds. The goal is that since they all have known signatures, any signature or heuristic system should be able to detect them as malicious files and quarantine or delete or destroy them depending on what your settings are. But within that 120 seconds or 2 minutes, the system should no longer be able to see these files. They should be quarantined or they should be deleted. If, however, that's not the case, and the file is not quarantined or deleted, the agent will destroy it by itself. So these are not left sitting on a disk somewhere. The second form of testing file is known as a scenario. Scenario files are built by Cymulate. They're not reverse engineered actual malware or anything like that. They're built by our team here at Cymulate, and they are fully executable. And so they're sent to the agent, again, in batches, and the agent initiates the executions. It kicks off these little applets. Scenarios perform malicious activities, but they do not endanger systems, applications, or data. And I'll give you two examples of this. The first example is if we're simulating a Trojan, very basic form of malware. We will send a scenario file, it will be initiated, and it may do things like attempt to modify the registry or attempt to inject a DLL. But it will not do that to accomplish anything worse than opening up a message box or starting a default calculator app. The goal is for a behavioral-based or more advanced EDR system to recognize that what this executable is attempting to do is malicious and therefore kill that scenario's process. If it doesn't, again, these executions will not actually put anything in danger, and they will be destroyed by the agent itself if they complete successfully and they're not removed. But with luck and with a properly configured EDR, they should be recognized as performing malicious actions, and they should be stopped and destroyed or quarantined. If, for example, we're doing something a bit more sophisticated, like simulating ransomware, the agent or the scenario itself, depending on which vector we're using, in this case it'll be the agent, creates a directory of fake files. They're of all different file types, and they're in a directory of their own, and they're created by the Cymulate system itself. The scenario will, again, attempt to perform malicious activities like gaining administrative privileges or creating a scheduled task or a hard link or something of that nature. And if it is not stopped by an EDR, then it will encrypt that directory of files that was created by the Cymulate system. So in other words, even though we are performing all of the same actions that a ransomware threat would perform, your data and your systems are safe. The only thing that can get encrypted is the directory of files that were created expressly for that purpose. So we have close to 400 of these different scenarios that do everything from Trojans to worms to ransomware to other forms of known malware. And they will perform the same methods and techniques, but do so in a manner that's not going to put anything in the organization in danger. Other built-in templates can focus on different types of behavior, or can focus on only sending those AV files for the appropriate operating system that the agent is running on. And of course, you can create your own template. So if we do that here, I could choose the OS I want to run against. Let's choose Windows. I can choose to use a stager simulating a drive-by infection, or I could do drop and execute from disk, which is simulating a user clicking on a link and downloading a file. I can choose whether or not I also want to send the AV files. That is optional. In our case, let's just go with compiled executable. This is creating a scenario, and this is your AV files. And then I need to define what scenarios I want to do. And there are two parts to these definitions. The first one is how will it execute? And the second is what type of malicious activity will it simulate? So, in terms of execution, we have multiple methods that are user-level permissions, and you could select as many as you would like. And we have multiple methods that are administrative permissions, and again, you can select as many as you would like. Based on those choices, the system will present me with a quite large array of different types of behaviors that can be simulated. And you notice that you can also create custom simulations. You can actually upload executables. Do keep in mind that if you do so, and they're not stopped by an EDR, they could put the environment in danger. So if you want to do things that are known safe only, then stick with the ones that we supply. And again, here we can choose as many of these different methods of simulated behavior as we want. So let's pick a couple of Trojans. Let's pick a few different types of ransomware. See, we have plenty to choose from here. And let's pick a couple of worms. And then as we go further down, there are, of course, many, many other options to choose from. But let's stick with this set of common malicious software. And then it will tell me what it is that we are about to do. So, First things first, it's going to tell me the selections that I've made. So I'm going to do this on Windows, and we can jump back and change any of these things as necessary, of course. We're going to allow these execution methods and simulate these types of malicious software. The Cymulate system will automatically create any valid combination of these two operands, these two variables, and will actually spell out what it is that we're going to be doing. These different types of files that do different types of activities using different types of executions. So you can go through this whole list and see if there's anything that is missing, and you can actually go back and change a couple things around, or you could leave it as is and you can save it, and then it will be available for use in one-time or automated simulations from that point forward until you edit it or delete it. Now, once you give us what will be simulated, where it will be simulated, when and how often it will be simulated, then you'll hit launch, and that will initiate the simulation. During the simulation, the system is continuously evaluating the results, and as soon as the simulation is complete, the reports are immediately available. And if we take a look at one of the latest reports in endpoint security, we did a simulation that used both the AV files and the scenario files, and we did it in an environment that had both traditional signature scanning and behavioral-based EDR type protections in place. And as we could see, the results were not too bad. We got all of the AV files. None of them were able to come through, and that is exceptional. Typically, there are at least 1 or 2% that do manage to sneak their way through, since that data set is continuously being updated, but in this case, none of them got through. That's great. Same for worm scenarios. None of the worms were able to completely execute. They were all detected. And when it comes to Trojans and ransomware, we didn't fare too badly, but about a third of the things we tried were successful in one way, shape, or form. And that's something that we'd probably want to take a look at to fine tune. So if I click into the ransomware category, for example, the system will show me in just a moment each and every scenario that was executed and how far that scenario was permitted to go before it was stopped. Now, we would expect that most of these would have at least a few steps complete before they are detected by a behavioral-based system. And that's because the first couple of steps can be perfectly benign, like asking what OS it's running on. But there are several, in our case, that had a significant amount of overt malicious activity. And by that I mean some steps, which definitely should have been declared malicious, were permitted to complete. So in cases like this Red Shield object right here, all of the steps completed. Had this been an actual ransomware attack, it would have been successful. And in others, like this spooler hijack, only part of the full execution of the scenario happened, but enough occurred that we have some concerns, and that's why this bar is indeed amber. And if I click on this, the system will show me each step that was taken throughout the entire scenario. Some of them were completed. When we got to the point where we were injecting a falsified print job to further the attack, it figured out that we were doing something malicious, and it killed our process, so that's good news. And then, of course, any steps beyond that were not applicable because the execution had been stopped. But prior to step 6, we were able to complete 5 separate steps, one of which is fairly benign, checking the operating system build. But when we get to steps 3 and 4, creating hard links and manipulating scheduled tasks, this is the hallmark of a known ransomware methodology known as Replace, R-I-P-L-A-C-E, that leverages hard links to trick the Windows OS into overwriting good files with copies of those files that have been encrypted, effectively encrypting the original files, but in a way that leverages a native functionality of Windows to make it happen. So the creation of a hard link by itself isn't necessarily malicious, and creation of scheduled tasks is not necessarily malicious. But when you see the two together like this, that's a big red flag. And as we can see, both of these steps completed, and we actually got one step further, before the EDR said, this is a malicious attempt. Now, cards on the table, we purposely misconfigured the EDR in this environment so that we could perform this demonstration, but we have seen very similar results to this in the real world as well, so it is concerning. And when I look at it, my next instinct is to say, okay, what happened and how can I prevent it from happening again? So if we look at step 4, an unknown application, creating and manipulating scheduled tasks, I can click the More Info button, and this will have the system present me with an information window. We'll identify what we did. We'll even link to more information if it came from a known framework, in this case the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We'll explain what footprints are left behind, what things can be used to detect that this type of activity is going on. And we'll provide as many different mitigation options as are possible for this type of malicious behavior. And in this case, we could use a third-party tool like an EDR and tune it to recognize this pattern of behavior. We could also use native domain functionality like GPOs to short circuit the attempt for an unknown application with a local administrator to create a scheduled task. So there are multiple ways that most security issues can be addressed, and we want to provide you with all of them so that you can evaluate them and determine which is the best fit for your specific environment. Wherever possible, we'll also give you analysis info and evidence. So for example, here we can show you the event IDs that were written to the Windows event log. And so you can confirm independently that this activity actually happened. If we were able to encrypt, for example, we have evidence of that encryption. We have the list of files that were encrypted so that you can confirm by looking on disk that those files in that directory created by Cymulate were indeed encrypted successfully. And so we're not asking you to take our word for these things happening. Wherever there is evidence that they occurred, we will present that evidence so you can see for yourself. And we'll do this for any active step that's taken. And we'll show you how we did it, what types of footprints are left behind for detection, and what can be done to mitigate against this particular type of malicious act. Now, the online system is great, especially if you're troubleshooting individual items, but offline reporting is also critical. And so in the Cymulate system, we provide for offline reporting as well. Let me jump back a couple of pages here so I can show you that. Each simulation has this Generate Report button. We also have these for the global view of all the simulations that were done across multiple security controls. And each form of simulation will have a minimum of 2 report types. The first one is a technical report. That contains every piece of information that is in the UI. It is a tremendous amount of data. These are usually 600-700 pages or more. And they are in PDF form. And so you can have this offline reference to look through and refer to anytime you need. They will each also have an executive report. And we're going to look at an executive report from the endpoint vector in just a moment. But that's designed for non-technical decision makers, management, third parties who just need top-level information, etc. And as I said, we're about to take a look at one of those. In addition, we'll provide any other forms of reporting that we can, depending on what was simulated and what vector it was in. So in this case, we can provide a report of the results of the simulation in a comma-separated value file. Since we sent the AV files, we can provide a listing of all the signatures that were used and whether they were detected or not. And if we're integrated with a SIEM or an EDR, and in this case we are integrated with both, then we can produce a report that says, for each action we took, was there a correctly recorded corresponding event and or alarm in that SIM, in that EDR system? And if I jump over to the integrations page, this is the current list, although this list is growing quite rapidly, of different vulnerability scanners, EDR systems, SIEM systems, and even source systems that we can connect to via API. And if we are connecting to them, then we can query those systems to determine if the events and alarms that we expected to see based on whatever it is we did actually showed up in their logs and in their reporting. And if not, it could indicate that you may need more logs to be ingested. You may need correlation rules to be reconfigured or created. but it's going to give you that sort of extra information that exists outside of the Cymulate world where it intersects with what Cymulate is doing. We also have our own API for reporting. So if you wanted to spool our report information into a third-party tool, you can use our API to do that, typically via JSON, though there's some flexibility there. And so these integrations really do extend the information that Cymulate can give you natively. And we do encourage them anytime you're using one of these systems that we support, and there will be many more over the coming months, to use those API integrations to get a much higher level look at what is occurring in terms of your security infrastructure. All right, so I did say that we would be looking at an executive report, and I have one here from a different endpoint security run than the one that we were looking at. Again, it was a run where we had both signature and heuristic detection and behavioral-based detection. And if I scroll up here, this is designed for the layman. This is designed for a business decision maker who may not be technically trained or may have technical training but not necessarily cybersecurity training. However, they still need to be kept appraised of this information. And so it's bottom line up front. Here's the Cymulate score. It is a 46. That's considered a medium or moderate threat. And so some things need to be addressed. The antivirus files, the AV files, were very well detected, so that's great. But when it comes to non-signatured malware, there are some things to be addressed. And what we want to give this business decision maker or third party is two pieces of information. What needs to be addressed, and from a business perspective, why is it critical that it be addressed? We also want to show what is going right. Because if budget was spent on, for example, an updated anti-malware signature detection solution, we want to show, like we're doing here, there's some room to improve, but this is doing fairly well. This is actually doing quite well. So what is going wrong? Well, we can see here from these amber and red bars that too many attack steps are completing. Now, I may need to go to the technical team to find out exactly which steps are being completed, but I know that too many of these steps are being completed. And why is that a business concern? Because too much ransomware and too many Trojans are succeeding in their attempts to attack. And that means that I have a liability, and liabilities need to be addressed. So how do I address these liabilities? I reduce these metrics. Now, as to the how, that is something that they should be doing in consultation with you to get recommendations for different products and different services and then implement them. But we can tell them what is happening, and we can tell them why it is critical that these issues be addressed from a real-world business perspective. If you get ransomware, that is a definitive budgetary loss because there will be loss of productivity. There will be public relations concerns. There may be disclosures that are required, etc. So this is now a definable issue that can be addressed. And to help with that, if we scroll down a bit more, we can benchmark against others in the same industry. There are 25 different industries to choose from, and as you see here, we have a more general set of statistics as well. It's all done entirely anonymously. And we can benchmark where this company is sitting as compared to others within the same industry. So if others in the industry are taking many more security precautions and coming back with better metrics, that could be an indicator that new tools, new systems are required. We'll also benchmark performance over the last 10 simulations that were performed. So if you're doing this every month, this would show the last 10 months of simulations. And in our case, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Last month somewhere, I put in a much more effective signature-based anti-malware detection system. And it shows that risk level for signatured malware has dramatically dropped. We have gotten a lot safer on that front. But at the same time, non-signatured malware, so newer types of malware that may not be identifiable to a standard signature scanner, have been increasing. Except for worms. Worms actually went down. That's good. But everything else is increasing. And what we want to see is that these metrics go down over time. This is how you demonstrate return on investment. ROI is very clear. I did this, and the level of risk was reduced. And so as new services and new products and new configuration options are brought to the table, these metrics go down and risk becomes lower and lower. And that's always a good thing. Now, additionally, since this is designed for a non-technical audience, we do define all of the terms that are used in the report. And this way, if it's being referred to weeks or months later, they have a reference point that they can use to understand what these different metrics are doing. We even define how we get to the Cymulate score and the different frameworks that we use and what the different levels of risk as gauged by the Cymulate scores indicate. So this is a sort of one-stop solution set for reporting to management, to third-party auditors, to anyone who needs to know the top-level numbers and doesn't need a deep technical report but does need to know what is going on. And this is available for all the different vectors that we have. All right, so we have taken a look at a single vector simulation, endpoint security. Now let's take a look at a multi-vector simulation. Let's look at immediate threat intelligence. So as I said, full kill chain APT allows you and your team to create simulations, picking and choosing what methods and techniques from each vector will be strung together to create an entire attack chain from start to finish. Immediate threats intelligence, conversely, allows Cymulate's threat research organization in conjunction with groups like CISA and CERT organizations and threat feeds, both public and commercial, to create simulations for newly propagating threats. So basically, we're looking for that point at which a threat which is a proof of concept becomes a threat which is propagating across the internet. And within about 24 hours of that turning point, our team will be creating one of these simulations. And you can see from the dates, this is a fairly daily situation for us. And that is unfortunate, but we're keeping pace with it because it is necessary these days to be looking at these things constantly. So if we look at one that was recent and actually was just posted at the time of this presentation, we can see this one was a malware that leveraged components of Outlook to spread it to additional people in the user's contact list. It comes in as an email attachment. And so if we were to run this simulation, then it would send the email to the designated test address. And pardon for the little flashes there. But it would send the email to the designated test address. And you can designate that here on the right-hand side by selecting the email address we will send it to. So this is always within your control. An agent will attempt to download the attack components, the files and the macros and scripts, and see if they are stopped at the web gateway by SSL inspection or content disarmament reconstruction. And if they are downloadable, they will be written to disk. We'll also check for the vulnerability in question, because this one does use an exploit. And we would then be able to report to you the results of your security control's ability to defend against this specific attack from start to finish. And let's take a look at one of those reports, actually. They are a little bit different than we saw with the endpoint, in that we're not looking at dozens or hundreds or thousands of different methods and techniques, but a very specific set of methods and techniques. And let's take a look at one from a little while ago that was a blue keep flaw. Eternal Blue is definitely living up to the eternal part of its name, and we are seeing these crop up again and again. And so when we did the simulation of this one in an environment that was misconfigured, the web gateway, the firewall, and SSL inspection systems did not catch the attack file. And we were therefore able to download it. And this one was downloaded by a user clicking on a malicious link on a web page, so there was no email component to this particular one. By the way, we can also show what was blocked, so we will be able to show you what went right as well as what did not go right. And in this case, nothing went right, unfortunately. The web gateway allowed the download of the file. When it was written to disk, the endpoint system did not recognize it as a malicious file, and so it was destroyed after 120 seconds. It was not left behind, but we now know from this simulation that this environment is vulnerable to this threat because none of the compensating controls are stopping it. If you are also allowing API communication with one of the vulnerability scanners we support, you can click on any of the CVEs. And we'll click on this one. In this case, we are talking to a Tenable IO configuration via API, but we do have a few that we support. And in addition to showing you all the information about the actual threat, since we are communicating with Tenable, Cymulate can request from Tenable a list of all devices known to not be patched against this threat as of the last vulnerability scan. In our case, we're lucky. It's only one machine out of about 30 that are in this lab. But I now know that I must go and patch this specific machine using these patches. And I need to do that immediately because my environment is not able to defend against this threat any other way. And once I've gotten those machines patched up, then I can focus on what was causing this file, which is just a regular exe file, to not be recognized. I can go to VirusTotal and see if my anti-malware solution already has recognition for this. If not, I can see the signatures that are used, and I can either manually add these, or I can consult with the vendor and find out why it wasn't able to detect this. And I can do the same thing for the web gateway. If I'm doing SSL inspection, why was this not detected? It has known signatures. And again, I can look in VirusTotal, I can force a signature update, I can consult with the vendor, whatever may be necessary. So we want to take care of the immediate risk, which is this machine or this set of machines is not patched and nothing is stopping them from being exploitable. And we want to take care of the global risk, which is my security controls need to have some changes made in order to ensure that they can properly deflect this form of attack. Now, the best part about immediate threats is that it also can be fully automated. And so what I can say is, anytime the Cymulate Threat Research Team posts a new threat, automatically simulate it and email me the results. And I can either say you will use this set of agents, or I can do as we've done here and simply say, look, any agent that is responding, use that agent. I can also say when they happen. By default, they will occur whenever the threat research team posts them to the system. And since they are not disruptive and they are not destructive, they can be run in the middle of the day in the production environment without endangering anything. But many customers and organizations prefer to set a specific time each day when these will be run. And so you could set a timer that will be local time to the environment in question. To the agent specifically, and at that time it will run any simulations that have been posted since the last execution window that we had. So not only do we allow you to look at how things impact individual sets of security controls like web gateways and endpoint security, we also let you look at how these different security controls act when they need to work together through immediate threats and through full kill chain. One last thing I'd like to show is lateral movement. This is technically a multi-vector simulation, and the way that it works, and it's almost always custom template here. So let's create a lateral movement simulation so you can see what this is all about. Lateral movement is if an attacker gains a foothold, they have gained control of a device. Where can they go within the secured perimeters? Can they jump between network segments? Can they get to sensitive servers or desktops or VMs? And so, again, we're going to use the same methods that attackers use, but we're going to do it safely. It's not going to reboot anything or knock services offline or any of that stuff. And the first thing we need to define is, how is this permitted to spread from machine to machine? You can choose any of these. You have to pick at least one, but you may choose to try all of them if you wish. The second thing, when we've spread to another machine, we need to land a miniature version of the Cymulate agent on that machine. And those are cleaned up when the simulation's done. They don't stick around. But in order to do that, we're going to have to gain administrative privileges to do the install. And so what methods will we be permitted to use, will the system be permitted to use, to perform that operation? And again, you have to pick at least one. You may choose all of them. And some of them are going to be specific to the environment. For example, if you don't use local admin password solutions, password management systems like that, then you probably don't want to use Steel Lapse. If you have particularly sensitive network segments, you may not want to use relay poisoning. And so we allow you to pick and choose which ones will be allowed and which ones will not be utilized. Now, once you've defined how we can attack things, you're going to tell us what we can attack. And that is done with scoping. Scopes can define either allowed IP ranges, and you can have more than one of each of these scopes as well, so you can define several different IP ranges, and excluded IP ranges, what the system is not permitted to attempt to spread to or land on. They can also be nested within each other, so you can have a large scope IP range with a smaller excluded range within it. And you can also aim at just one machine if you wanted to test the effectiveness of just one device. So if you set nothing here, we will continue until we exhaust, and if I scroll down a bit you could see this, the scan class, which can be a class A, B, or C subnet. So we will continue by default until we have exhausted the class C subnet that the initial agent where we're starting from sits in. So there's a lot of different ways that you can set up the limits, the boundaries of this lateral movement simulation. You can also change some of the aggressiveness, the scan rates, parallel job limits. They are suitable for most environments, but if you have a particularly sensitive subnet, you may want to work with these. And the simulation will continue until we exhaust the scan class within the scopes you set, or we cannot find any new devices for a period of 10 minutes, and then it will end. There are a couple of additional options here. One is that as we move through the network, we can look for the Eternal Blue exploit, not actually part of lateral movement, but something that many different organizations asked us to provide as part of the simulation, and so we happily added that in. We can even attempt to use GPO network access. Finally, we have crown jewels. Now, there is one predefined crown jewel. That is a domain controller. If a domain controller is compromised, the attacker could create new credentials, change existing credentials. They basically can do pretty much whatever they want if they have administrative access to a domain controller. So if the system is able to land successfully on a DC, then that will have a higher impact on the overall scoring than the capture of a desktop or a regular server. That being said, in most environments, there are other devices and other users that should be considered just as critical if they are captured. And Crown Jewels allows you to define the devices by IP or entire network segments, if network segments are supposed to be off limits, users or domain groups. And you can have multiples of each one of these as well. So if we capture something that's noted by you as a crown jewel, it will have an equal impact in the overall scoring, higher than a standard server or desktop. And then we would save this as a new template, and we would be able to aim at a particular agent that's installed in the environment and set it to either do it once or to automate this to run on a schedule that you set. And the difference in this really comes in the reporting. So the rest of what we do here at Cymulate, the data that is received by the Cymulate cloud is not considered privileged. And that's because anyone who understands how things like tracking pixels work, for example, can determine whether or not an email was successfully received by a recipient. Anyone who can set up a fake link on a website can determine if their file could be downloaded by a user because the click itself is tracked. And so that information is not privileged, whether or not a file was able to be downloaded, whether or not an email was delivered with a poisoned attachment successfully. This is all data that could be obtained by an outside observer without necessarily breaching the security of the environment itself. Lateral movement is a different story, because in lateral movement, the data that is recovered is quite sensitive. And if we look at a lateral movement run, you could see that we get things like credentials and tokens and databases and workstation and server names and things like that. And so by default, that data is stored within the agent or on a network share within your environment. It is not by default transmitted back to Cymulate. Now, you can do reporting on it. Because you can take the zip file that's sitting on that agent and load it into a web page that has pre-downloaded JavaScript elements and doesn't need to communicate with the Cymulate cloud to show the results. And the results look something like this. And this is going to generate these results for us here from a zip file. And you can see it's taking a little bit longer than any of our other reports because it does have to generate this information. And so the technical reporting and the visual reporting are most definitely available, but it doesn't by default send this information back to the Cymulate cloud because of the sensitivity of the data in question. And now we can see this beginning to populate some stuff. And what we'll see in just a few seconds is that in this case, we were able to compromise pretty much the whole network. And here's the map of that network. And this device that I'm moving over here to the right, this is where the agent that I installed to start the simulation exists. From this device, we were able to land a miniature agent on every other circle on this map. Blue circles are desktop operating systems, yellow circles are server operating systems, and red circles are domain controllers, or otherwise are crown jewels. In this case, the only crown jewel we had declared was the domain controllers, and these red circles are. And you'll see that we'll show you the path that we took to get from the original agent through the intervening servers all the way to this domain controller that I've selected, but it's hard to follow on the overall map. And so when I select an object, as I've done here, this call to action button pops up. I click that, and I can now see a timeline from the original agent through any intermediate servers to the device that I selected, in our case, the domain controller. And at each step of the way, I can see the spread method that successfully got us to the next device. In this case, it was SMB across the board. And again, when you click on that, we'll show you its description, how it can be detected in an environment, what methods can be used to mitigate it, and we'll provide as many as possible, and what attack method was used. And in our case, access token manipulation was used in each hop. It is not unusual to, if you've selected multiple methods, to see different methods being used from hop to hop. And the reason for that is one server may not have its SMB enabled, and we use a different method like WMI or DCOM to jump to that machine. Another server may already have some of these group policy mitigations against using access token manipulation. And so we may need to use password spraying or some other method to get access to it. In our case, it was pretty much the same thing all the way through. And we can go server by server and see all this stuff. And for each device, we could see what data was collected. In this case, no passwords. That's great. 4 hashes. And if we look at those hashes, we have some server accounts, some application accounts. In here, we've got a VMware service account and a user account here. And 1 token. And the token was a user token. Probably an administrative user, and we were able to use their credentials and perform token manipulation to get us to the next step in the chain. Now, if we jump back to the overall map, then we could see the grand totals of all of the different data objects we collected. So in this case, 259 tokens, 663 sets of credentials. These are both hashes and username password credential sets. So hashes you can see here, and if we scroll down a bit, we'll get into passwords as well. Right about here. So you can see here we also were able to collect username password combinations for some users and some systems. And if they do broadcast what permissions groups they're in, like in this case we had local admin, domain admin, we'll put that information in as well. Now you notice we're only showing the first 3 characters of the hash or the password. That is because while we do have to record that for evidence of the compromise, we don't want to really store the actual configuration. With the first 3 characters, I can go to whoever manages this account and say, does the password start with these characters, and prove that yes, we were able to get it. We'll also tell you how we got it. In this case, these passwords were recovered because one application or more was storing them as clear text in the system memory. We were able to dump that system memory and get them. If we scroll down a bit, we've got one that was achieved by password spraying. And if there's a group policy that says you're only allowed 4 tries before we lock your account, the system will stay at 3 tries just to make sure that we don't lock anybody's account out. But one of them we were successful, and we got it by basically password spraying. In this case, we were able to dump the credential manager. And there's many different techniques. And again, you have to tell us which techniques are allowed. So the system will not do anything that you didn't give it permission to do. In our case, we gave it permission to do all of this, and it successfully did it in many different ways. You can export any of these to CSV and get offline reporting, either for any individual component or for the entire operation. And so you do have offline reporting options available here, even though it is not going through the reporting engine that's in the Cymulate cloud. All right, so we have looked at single vector simulations. We have looked at multi-vector simulations. And we've looked at some reporting, both online, offline, executive reporting, etc. And so this should give you a really good feel for what it can be done with the Cymulate system. So let's look at some of the questions that have come in. Okay, first one, do the agents have to be deployed on every device? So that's a no. The agents are deployed one for each unique set of security controls. So basically, if everybody's using the same firewall and the same anti-malware and they're in the same domain, you really only need one agent. There are environments where you'll need more than one. Typically more complex environments with lots of network segregation or a really big propagation of Windows, Mac, and Linux across the environment and things like that. But you want to keep the number of agents to an absolute minimum. More agents do not give better results, and they do mean that there are more things that you've got to manage from one point or another. The agents update themselves, but you still are going to want to keep an eye on them because it's a piece of software running in your environment. So minimum number of agents only. Definitely not agents on every device or even close to that. Second question was, can we use our own attacks? And the answer to that is yes. In most of our vectors, you do have the ability to upload custom commands, custom executables, custom attachments for things like email. You should be extraordinarily careful because if the system is successful and your anti-malware or firewall or email system doesn't stop that custom command or executable, you could be placing your organization at risk. And so we don't recommend it. We recommend using the built-in attack methods and techniques because they have been vetted and they are safe and they won't cause disruptions or destruction of data or systems. But you do have the ability to use your own custom executions where you would like to. Just be very, very careful with them. Third one is, do I have to use all of the vectors? The answer is you certainly can, and we do have bundle pricing and a lot of these things that can help with that. But you also can use these in a modular fashion. So if you, for example, already had a phishing awareness tool, you're not required to use ours. We can do some very nifty things like tell you how a user is failing a phishing test. Are they taking the time to evaluate the email, or are they just opening it and then immediately clicking on something? So there are benefits to using our tools. We believe that they offer some really strong advantages. But if you already have one of these vectors covered with a different tool, you're not required to use ours. The system is designed to be modular. And I think, yep, that was all the questions we got. There were 3 really good ones, though, so that's great. So I will, of course, be available via email, as our entire support staff is, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that come up after this point. And until then, I wish everybody a great rest of your day and stay safe out there. And we're looking forward to helping you out to do proofs of concept and to get this running in your environment. Thank you very much.